introduction, I'm from Nature Scot, formerly known as Scottish Natural Heritage. And as you'll probably know, this is the second of 2 seminars looking at the subject of climate change. The first one was held 2 weeks ago under the general heading of Opportunities for Change, and we had 3 excellent speakers then. Alistair Rennie from Dynamic Coast, Steve Farland from SEPA, and Keith Masson from Highland Council. If you missed that seminar, then you can watch it again. There was a recording, and that's available on the Highland Environment Forum website. There were a number of questions that were raised in the chat line as well at that seminar that we were unable to answer at the time, and answers to those questions are also now on the Highland Environment Forum website, so I would encourage you to go there if you missed out. So this seminar will also be recorded, so I hope that's okay with everybody. It's also looking at climate change in the Highlands, and it's under the broad theme of working together with nature, benefits and responsibilities. We've got 3 more excellent speakers for you, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from them shortly. We've got Paul Sizeland from Nature Scot, John RIsby from Scottish Forestry, and Andrew Midgely from the RSPB. We'll run today's seminar along the same lines as we did previously. It seemed to work quite well then. So each speaker will be given 15 to 20 minutes to give their presentations, and then there'll be around 10 minutes of questions after that. If you do have questions, please could you raise them through the chat function. So if you're not quite sure how to do that, the chat function is a little, it's one of the tools on your screen. If you click on that box, a dialog box will appear on the right hand side of the screen, and you can just ask your question in there. And Andy and Keith, my 2 colleagues, will be keeping an eye on the chat line, and they'll be pulling questions together to put to the presenters after their presentations. If I could ask you also to keep your microphones on mute throughout to avoid any background noise and disturbance. Okay, so that's enough from me. I'm very pleased to be to introduce our first speaker, who is Paul Sizeland from Nature Scot. Paul's career is founded on a degree in forestry from the University of Aberdeen. Since then, his working life broadly breaks down as 6 years in Scotland, working with native woodlands and NGOs, as well as commercial woodland management, 10 years managing community forestry and rural development partnership projects in Nepal, 6 years managing climate change, urban sustainability, environment and health knowledge exchange services and research projects in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Europe, 6 years managing strategic business planning at SEPA and with international development agencies. And for the last 8 years, Paul has been the biodiversity strategy manager with Nature Scot, managing habitat networks and green network partnerships. So over to you, Paul.
Ben, thank you very much. And first of all, apologies that you can't see me. Maybe that's a blessing, but I can't get my camera to work. And if you just bear with me whilst I get my screen up. So I shall do my best to choose the correct screen. Now, can people see a slide?
Yes, we can, Paul.
That's perfect. Okay, I shall just kick off. So, yeah, as Ben has said, my name is Paul Sizeland. I work for Nature Scot, and Ben has already covered the name change, and the name change is to highlight more clearly the work we do and who we do it for. So I'm going to talk about the impacts of climate change and how biodiversity can address both mitigation of the causes, but also offer solutions to the impacts. And also to think about how nature might become more resilient to climate change, including through thinking about habitat networks. And as we know, the climate emergency and biodiversity crises is inseparably interlinked. So, not to confuse uplands with highlands, but the highlands do comprise much of Scotland's uplands, and uplands have many definitions depending on the situation and topic that's being discussed. The definition that we have most commonly used is all land above the limit of enclosed farmland. However, there are other definitions which include altitude, so land above 300 to 400 meters, land use, habitat types, or whether the land is improved, semi-improved, or unimproved. And almost 5 million hectares of Scotland is upland, and that's 62% of the land area. Now, a third of the uplands are bog, with the remainder being made up of acidic rough grassland, dwarf, shrub, heath, flushes and rock habitats. And renowned and revered for the wildness, the open character of the uplands is due in large part to deforestation, heavy grazing pressures from sheep and red deer, and muir burn related to farming, crofting, and especially grass moor management. The Highlands do, of course, comprise coastal and lowland features with important and diverse habitats of their own. So there are many pressures on these habitats. These range from climatic, loss of biodiversity, invasive non-natives, farming, development, sport and recreation. And we've seen the loss of biodiversity mainly in wading birds, curlew especially, and some of the declines are dramatic, but we're also seeing habitat changes. Earlier melting of winter snowbeds, seeing changes in species composition. So for example, dwarf shrubs and specialist liverbirds have decreased, while graminoids have increased, and reduction in dotterel numbers as they are continuing north due to lack of late lying snow. And we're seeing extreme weather events more frequently and changing seasonal patterns. For example, these can be seen in the hatching of chicks, which are becoming out of sync with the emergence of insects affecting brood success. Habitats are becoming homogenized, with species being seen in areas where they never were before. Grassland and heath vegetation have declined in species richness and variation in community composition, with increases in generalist graminoids. Species seen tend to have a preference for warmer, drier, and more acidic conditions. And then, of course, there's COVID-19, which has exposed the effects on rural communities, many of which are remote and in upland locations. And we've seen much of the agricultural management continuing, but social isolation increased and the lack of rural broadland has added to this. And these communities are often reliant on green tourism, which dramatically has been reduced during lockdown. So to present the global context of climate change, now you will have seen many of these graphs showing the increasing global temperature rise since pre-industrial times. Now this one is taken from the NASA website and compares what the global temperature would be expected to be due to solar radiation without any influences of people on the lower line, and the upper line shows the actual change, indicating that we're about 1.5 degrees above that and rising. The species of the Scottish mountains are on the front line when it comes to climate change impact and have particular significance because they are on the edge of range for many Arctic and alpine species. They represent the southern range extent for Arctic species and western extent of alpine specialists. The impacts of climate change on mountain weather will be complex, but all scenarios are clear that the extent and duration of snow cover is likely to decline significantly in the medium to long term. So let us look first at the Scottish Government's targets for net zero and then a range of examples of work we are taking forward to tackle the impact of climate change. So last year we published a plan endorsed by government, our climate change commitments, and this includes ambitious targets. Now the Climate Change Act is a statutory commitment, and the Climate Change Committee set ambitious targets for us in Scotland to meet net zero by 2045, and NatureScot is committed to ensure that nature makes a key contribution to that. Okay, so some key facts and figures in this. So in a net zero world, emissions, also known as the sources, if you like, must be balanced by removals, which we call the sinks. Baseline emissions for Scotland in 1990 were 75 million tonnes CO2 equivalent, falling to 41.6 million tonnes CO2 equivalent in 2018. But wetlands and peatlands will be included in the National Atmospheric Emissions Inventory from 2022, adding a further 6 to 10 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent to emissions, because degraded peat is a net emitter of greenhouse gases, and 70% of Scotland's blanket bog and 90% of our raised bogs have been damaged to some degree. Now by 2045, any residual emissions, including unavoidable emissions from farming and ongoing emissions from degraded peatlands, must be offset by removals from land use management. So whilst nature-based solutions, and I'll be speaking about these later, might be regarded as nice to have for 1990 to 2022, but they're essential from 2022 onwards and forever thereafter, because we've effectively used up the global carbon budget for all people for all time associated with avoiding dangerous climate change. And for farming and land use, mitigation equals adaptation equals state of nature, which is to say that they all amount to the same thing. You cannot do one without the other, and they all need to be done on the same finite area of land. Hence, we need to promote nature-based solutions that provide multiple benefits for people and nature. So in essence, what this slide is showing is the extent to which emissions have to be reduced and the amount of carbon sequestered to meet the 2045 net zero target. So where the green bits illustrate land-based contributions from farming, forestry, and other land cover. The best way to store carbon is not to burn or release what is already stored in the ground, obviously. Vegetation and soils are an important carbon store. Where healthy, they lock up carbon and prevent emissions. The main carbon stores include peatlands, woodland, marine, a so-called blue carbon, and uncultivated and agricultural soils. Storage can be considered to be long-term. For example, peatlands, which accrue very slowly, and marine sediments, medium-term, like woodland, or short-term, like agricultural land, where changes in farming practices can quickly reverse any benefits. Changing how we manage land to increase how much carbon is held in vegetation, soils, and seabeds is central to climate change mitigation, as is the annual carbon sequestration rate from key carbon-rich habitats. Climate change is locked in, so richer and more diverse vegetation and soils are critical to enable nature to adapt to the warming climate. For instance, bird and butterfly populations are moving north in response to the changing climate. A rich nature can also help us adapt by reducing the warming in cities, protecting soils, coastlines, and food production. So why are nature-based solutions so beneficial? So nature-based solutions are ecosystems, whether natural or modified, that can provide multiple benefits in terms of carbon sequestration, biodiversity, benefits for human well-being, as well as making businesses more resilient, food production more sustainable, reducing flooding and buffering against shocks. So this includes our woodlands, peatlands, rivers, and wetlands, provided they are healthy, as only if they are healthy can they offer their full potential. But we can also think of habitats which farmers have created, such as hedgerows and agroforestry. Nature-based solutions are cost-effective, and globally, including important tropical ecosystems, are estimated to be capable of achieving roughly 30% of the emissions reductions needed for global net zero. Their transformative effect in the landscape are generally cheaper than engineered solutions, delivering multiple complementary benefits for society. So let's get into a bit of the detail to show what nature-based solutions can achieve. So as highlighted, Scotland has made great progress already with reducing carbon emissions, mainly by decarbonising the power sector. But with good management, we can help tackle carbon emissions by protecting what is already stored in the environment and by managing our nature to collect and store more carbon. So how does this work? So Scotland's carbon-rich habitats, as described, store a lot of carbon and are worth looking after. There is significant effort to ensure that the carbon store remains in place and increases. Other benefits flow from maintaining and increasing this store. Now note the difference in values in the slide. Some habitats are better than others in terms of the overall carbon stored, but we need a mix of healthy habitats, the right habitat in the right place, both to store carbon and to provide other benefits, such as producing food, water, flood protection, and so on. So we're placing heavy emphasis on nature-based solutions, and there are three generic benefits given here: reducing net emissions, contributing to global efforts to moderate future climate change, helping our society and economy adapt to climate change we're already locked into, and contributing to addressing the global biodiversity crisis. So let's look at some examples, beginning with species and habitat work. The species recovery and adaptation. We're beginning to see the increase in generalist upland grasses and a reduction in dwarf shrub, forb, and lichen cover due to climate warming and acidification. The whole landscape is losing some of its structural diversity as habitats lose diversity, especially the specialist species. To ensure that species are resilient to climate heating, some things have to be looked at in a broad scale beyond the limits of the uplands. There are, however, other pressures on land which can exacerbate the impact of climate heating. Therefore, reducing these can ensure that we are doing all that we can to protect these vulnerable habitats and species. And these can include grazing, muir burn, tourism, recreation, and development. And we can also make changes through human intervention to move species under the Scottish Code for conservation translocations. Now, just to touch on an example that a colleague within Nature Scot has been working on. So we've looked at translocations considering the future of a species which is threatened by climate heating. And in considering this translocation, there are a number of considerations. Can we increase resilience of extant populations? Can we improve wider management and increase connectivity to allow for natural adaptation? And should we translate the species to a new location? So Nature Scot with James Hutton and Royal Botanic Gardens Edinburgh have looked at the possibility of translocating a lichen, Pavocetraria nivalis, and this species was chosen as it's easily identifiable. It's got a distinct altitudinal distribution and has relatively limited biotic interactions. The species' current range is in the Cairngorm Mountains. So within its range, translocations were trialled covering a range of altitudes, vegetation types, including likely and less likely locations, and survival was recorded after 1 and 5 years. Now, current models are coarse, and the prediction of success is not great, as there is a high level of transplant mortality. Microhabitat requirements improves the fit of the model, but ultimately early action, while there are sufficient donor populations and an element of ecological experience, is vital. So in short, it's not easy, it's very resource intensive, and it's highly unpredictable. Wildfire can occur for a number of different reasons, but the impacts from these are the same. Wildfires can result in destruction of habitats, change in species composition, loss in structural diversity, disturbance or loss of bird breeding sites and nests, invertebrates, small mammals, reptiles and amphibians, and so on, and increased likelihood of impacts on soil structure and erosion. It's therefore important that we reduce the potential for wildfires, which can be achieved through habitat management to ensure that it's in good condition, education, training, and communication of the risks. Muir burn can be used to create fire breaks, and the Muir burn code and the supplementary information is used to ensure best practice in that. And we're working in a number of different areas to understand wildfire and reduce the risks of wildfire occurring. For example, our geographic information team have been mapping pre and post burn areas since 2018 using analysis-ready Sentinel-2 images processed by JNCC. And this information can be used to improve post-fire management decisions and build a better understanding of where and when fire is occurring, which is important to understand as our climate changes. And the Scottish Fire Danger Rating System, we are working with the James Hutton Institute to gather information on fire behaviour and trails so that a system can be developed which is specific to Scotland. And we're also involved in the Scottish Wildfire Forum, and we host the Muir Burn Code through being part of the Muir Burn Code Working Group. And then how to incorporate woodland into the uplands. This can arguably be best achieved through riparian woodland. Riparian woodlands can provide multiple benefits, and there's a particular need to restore upland riparian woodland to provide climate resilience. Shading from stream-side trees keeps water temperatures cool. Without this, we will see water temperatures too high for salmon and trout in coming decades. Furthermore, riparian woodlands reduce flow rates and support chettle structure, providing protection against extreme rainfall consequences like flooding and erosion. And so on to peat. Okay, so 25% of Scotland is peatland. We've got 1.8 million hectares of blanket bog, which stores 1.6 billion tonnes of carbon. Peatland contributes to multiple ecosystem services, but the most important thing to note is that the ongoing emissions from degraded peatland is adding to climate heating. From 2022, emissions from peatland will be included in the National Atmospheric Emissions Inventory. And as said, that will add a further 6 to 10 million tonnes CO2 equivalent a year. 70% of our blanket bog and 90% of our raised bogs are damaged or degraded in some way. As such, peatland restoration is vital, and there's a long way to go, as currently we are only decreasing the amount of CO2 being emitted, not reversing it. Since 2012, Scottish Government has invested £33 million in peatland restoration via the Peatland Action Project and the Agri-Environment Climate Scheme under the Scottish Rural Development Programme. To be able to deliver the targets within the climate change plan and achieve net zero as indicated in the earlier bar chart, there needs to be a significant increase in the rate of restoration. So just using peat as an example then, can habitat networks help nature become more resilient to climate change impacts as described earlier? So in my previous role with Nature Scot, I managed an EU LIFE project based in the central belt of Scotland called Ecological LIFE, and its entire approach was to restore or create patches of similar habitat to improve habitat connectivity and thereby strengthen the overall habitat network. So this slide shows a project site in the central belt where we worked with butterfly conservation to restore degraded peatlands near Carnwath in South Lanarkshire. And in this slide, the hatched areas, with the exception of the long line at the bottom, are peatland SSIs, none of which are in a favourable condition. So we use many and extensive GIS data sets, and this shows areas of heath vegetation from Centre for Ecology and Hydrology data, which is additional to the SSIs. So there's more peatland in the landscape than just where those SSIs are located. And then more peatland is revealed when we include another GIS layer, which includes soils that have been planted on with trees. Then, if we use a habitat network algorithm to indicate the habitat network potential between these, and if they are fully functioning and brought into favourable condition, we can see that they can create virtual network across the landscape. So just to give you an idea of what the landscape looks like in this area, you can see the farmland and just how otherwise segregated and fragmented this habitat would be. And the areas in blue with the blue surrounds are those patches that we actually worked on. So in an unchanging or very slowly changing climate, this ought really to be good for increasing the resilience of species in these habitats. Okay, so this is my final slide. So just in case there are no questions, I thought I would ask one. So to what extent can strengthened habitat networks help nature adapt to climate change pressures? And is it the same for all habitats and species? Sorry, that was two questions. And there's just a few prompts there on the screen. So maybe that's something that we might think about discussing after this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was a really interesting and comprehensive presentation covering lots of areas. And we do have a number of questions that have come up through the chat line, some specifically directed to Nature Scot, and there is one directed to the council. Perhaps I could turn to Keith and Andy and pull those questions out and direct the ones to Nature Scot to Paul now.
Yeah, happy to do so. First of all, I guess the first question is, why is Nature Scot promoting muir burn? This is an outdated practice that should be banned.
That's quite a tricky question for me to answer. It's not an area that I have got responsibility for. I'm absolutely happy to take that away. Everybody can hear that the question has been asked. We've indicated there one of the ways in which it is useful in terms of control of wildfire, the spread of wildfire. But I would rather just take that question away if you don't mind. I don't have the line on that, but I'd be absolutely happy to share the answer with you and the wider group, if that's okay.
That'd be great, Paul. Thank you. And then we can add it when we upload the recording later on. Another question coming through. I'm conscious of time, so we may not be able to get through all the questions. But The next question, should the government be paying farmers to plant trees in suitable upland areas rather than subsidising sheep farming?
Okay, so this is an emerging area of work, which is, I suppose, the replacement of the current agri environment and farm support scheme under pillars 1 and 2, and Scottish Government with ourselves are looking at ways in which we can best administer these schemes for the benefit of biodiversity, but also to sustain a farming practice, food production, and farming community. And there are various trials going on. And I think what's happening is that the favoured approach is that it's an outcomes-based approach. So it's not about this or that. It's more about how do we secure benefits for society and benefits for biodiversity through support schemes. So, I mean, I can't give the line, if you like. I mean, it's a balancing act between achieving for biodiversity, achieving for sustainable farming, and achieving for wider society benefits. So really, it's that continual balance. But make it be known that Nature Scot is absolutely firmly to try to achieve sustainability and for biodiversity to feature within that balance.
We also have a we also have a really interesting question, actually. I was quite taken with the contribution that marine sediment makes to storing CO2, and a question that's coming in at the end here is, what is the strategy, or indeed is there a strategy, to protect and increase marine sediment with the aim of storing CO2?
Okay, again, that's that's an area of specialism that I can't answer directly. We have it's probably true to say that the strategies for the marine environment are more advanced at the moment than they are even for the terrestrial environment, and there's a number of marine strategies, part of which does include increasing the amount of blue carbon and recognizing the contribution it makes to sequestering carbon. But again, I think if you wanted more info on that, I'd need to defer to marine colleagues, if that's okay. So that'd be another question, I'm afraid, that I can't answer directly.
Okay, thanks, Paul. We have got time for a few more questions, and there are certainly quite a few questions coming through.
Yeah.
You able to pull a couple out, Keith?
Absolutely, yeah. One of the first question actually was in respect of peatland protection and restoration as being critical to containing carbon, as Paul's very well highlighted in the presentation, but there's an assumption that the council don't seem to recognise this. I would say that's probably unfair, given the involvement that the council has had in the World Heritage Site for the Flow Country work, and our climate change coordinator was very heavily involved in that project. And over and above that, we're, as the council, starting to facilitate a lot more work around the use of landscapes as carbon sinks, and putting Edinburgh Centre for Carbon Innovation in touch and to help work alongside Nature Scot and a peatland partnership in terms of identifying mechanisms to further enhance peatlands across Highland and the ability to store and sequester carbon going forward. So we do recognise that it's fundamental to Highland's contribution to Scotland's overall 2045 targets. There's also another question, Paul, in respect of beavers in particularly, and Nature Scot as an organisation licensing the killing of endangered protected beavers. Given that beavers are key to helping Scotland tackle the climate and ecological crisis, are there any non-lethal alternatives that could be used instead? And I'm just wondering if you've got any comments on that.
Okay, then absolutely. I mean, it's obviously been covered quite widely in the press recently, and there's been a number of parliamentary questions about this. And there is, of course, alternatives, and that's to trapping, for trapping and relocating beavers. But again, it's a relatively recent program, and there have both been unlicensed releases as well as licensed releases, and and licenses, as has been said, have been issued for for the killing of beavers. But I think the presumption is that trapping and relocating is the preferred method, and I think it's fair to say that NatureScot will be reviewing control methods. So I think it's really a question of watch this space, and it's a fairly politicized, it's a politicized situation that we're in, and there is an ongoing debate about this. But clearly, NatureScot has to strike a balance between all interests in land management, land managers, and their interests, and so on. And we will continue to have to tackle these tricky conflicts.
Thanks, Paul. That's it. Answer. Ben, do we have time for one final question?
One final question then, and then we'll move on to our next speaker. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So the question is in respect of emissions from peatland being very large, obviously, and we've estimated the impact on Highland at 900,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide as an inroad into the estimated sequestration from land use of 1.5 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide. The question is, do you have confidence in these large peatland emissions estimates?
Okay, that is a good question, and yeah, statistics damn lies and statistics. It's tremendously difficult. In order to in all of the whole arena of biodiversity, nature, and carbon and so on, to communicate accurately, simply, and convincingly that we have a case is going to be an ongoing challenge. So, do I have confidence? I think we have to go with the best estimates, the best research-based estimates that we have. Something like peat that has various depths across the landscape, and it's been forming in places for the last 10,000 years, and we have got rough estimates of how much is accrued each year, and so on and so forth. There's variations altitudinally according with rainfall, and so on. So, do I have confidence? We have to use the best data we have, but I don't think we should let data get too much in the way of trying to provide an argument and a call to action. So as far as the data goes, I do have confidence that it's about communicating without getting too bogged down in whether we've got the right decimal point or the right I think we need to be in the ballpark. We often round up and round down in order to make a point. So I think, yeah, I agree. I think what we should do, though, is if they are questioned, that we can point to the source of the data, and we do try to do that all the time.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I'm conscious of time, and we have two other speakers. I'm also aware that other questions are coming in as we're speaking. I'm not going to attempt to answer those now. If we've got time at the end, we can come back to them, and if we don't come back to them, then we'll certainly answer them on the Highland Environment Forum website. So thanks for your questions and keep them coming in. But I would now like to turn to John RIsby from Scottish Forestry. Ties in very well with what Paul has been saying about the role of trees and woodland in terms of carbon sequestration. So John is a professional forester. He's got 30 years of experience of forestry throughout the north of Scotland. He's got particular experience in community and environmental aspects of forestry, and he's passionate about supporting the management of native woodlands of all sizes and types. For the last 11 years, John has been the conservator for the Highlands and Islands, and he's overseen the rapid expansion of native woodland planting during this time. So, John, can I hand over to you to give your presentation, please?
Thanks, Ben. Hopefully my camera's working, so you should be able to see me, I hope.
Yes, we can.
I'm not seeing my presentation, which I'm hoping Keith's kindly going to put up for us.
I'm trying my best. I'm having some technical problems at the moment, unfortunately, but just bear with me.
Thanks, Keith. Yeah, I had the same issue, so hopefully we'll get my presentation. But anyway, thanks to Carolyn and the group for inviting me to speak today. I'm the Conservator for Highlands and Islands with Scottish Forestry. Scottish Forestry is a new Scottish Government agency, just less than 2 years old. And I'm responsible for the Highland and Islands, which is a large area, as you know, 40% of Scotland's land area. So I think I'll just keep going given the time pressures, even though you can't see my presentation, and hopefully it'll appear. I think, as Paul has mentioned in his presentation, it's important to start with existing woodlands. There's some 400,000 hectares in my conservancy of existing woodland, 40% of all Scotland's native woodlands, and 58 out of the 84 Caledonian Scots pine inventory sites. So native woodlands and native species are really important components of the woodland area. And of course, there's a considerable amount of carbon in these forests and woodlands. And you can't see, but I was just going to say, as a result of the post-war planting of conifers, timber production is still increasing in the area. And how that timber is used has a big bearing on the total carbon picture. Sorry you're not seeing my presentation, but hopefully it'll appear at some point.
Just 2 seconds. I think it might be because Paul's still sharing his screen. Paul, would you mind stopping sharing, and then I might be able to share John's presentation?
I'll just keep going. The best slides are later on anyway in the presentation. So,
huge apologies, I think that was me.
Oh. So the policy context, as Paul's mentioned, probably the really big driver for what I want to talk about today, which is woodlands and carbon, is the Climate Change Act and plan. And that's where the expansion of woodland targets come from, the Scottish Government targets for expanding woodland. And that, I think, gives a unique opportunity for native woodlands. Can you still hear me? Everything's gone kind of blank at my end.
We can hear you, John. Yeah. How are you getting
Okay.
on with the presentation, Keith? Is it likely to appear?
I'm doing my best. I'm just getting a circle at the moment. Bear with me.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just keep going. I mentioned that we're a relatively new agency, which arose from in 2019, the Scottish Government passed a new Forestry Act. That's the first Forestry Act since 1967. And that completed the full devolution of forestry to Scotland and to the Scottish ministers, and ended the role of Forestry Commission in Scotland effectively, and set up 2 new agencies. Forest and Land Scotland, which manages the estate, and ourselves, Scottish Forestry, which deals with all aspects of regulation of forestry, promotion through grants, and policy, forestry policy. The Act also required us to produce a forestry strategy. Well, we've led it on behalf of Scottish Government. It's a Scottish Government forest strategy, which is now in place. So given the time, I was just going to really focus a bit on the woodland expansion and the targets to expand woodland, because the Highlands have got a big role to play in that. And as I said, I think it's a unique opportunity actually for native woodland expansion. So the target in the Climate Change Act was 10,000 hectares a year for Scotland, rising to 15,000 by 2025. Well, that's changed several times actually, and it's now the target's 12,000 a year, and it's just been announced very recently that the target's to go up to 18,000. That was in the programme for government by 2024-25, which isn't very far away in forestry terms, to collect seed, grow plants, etc. That's actually very close. I mean, we have other key targets around improving the condition of native woodlands, but I won't really have time to get into that today, other than to say we still regard that as a top priority because, as I've said, these woodlands are the foundation we're working from. So what does that mean? Well, you would see a nice graph at the moment that shows planting since the 70s in Scotland. So what does 12,000 or 18,000, which has just been announced in 1st of September, what does that actually look like? Well, it's actually of a scale that hasn't been seen since the 80s, when there was the big conifer plantings, including the Flow Country. So it's a lot of trees, and that was the title of my talk today. Lots of trees. So it's definitely a lot of trees. It's definitely a challenge. And I suppose what I wanted then to talk about is how is that realized, and how is that realized in a way that is of benefit, both from a carbon but a wider environmental, social and economic point of view. Well, you'll know about the sensitivity of the Highlands and the designated sites, and you'll know about the land tenure of the Highlands, and the importance of sporting estates, crofting, and increasingly community-owned land for achieving woodland expansion targets. So although these are, we have ownership of these targets from the government, it's all about enabling other people to deliver the trees. Forestry and Land Scotland, the agency that manages the estate, has a role to play, but it delivers a very small amount of the target, as I'll come on to show. So key to this is deer management. And my next two slides were, I mean, this term's used a lot, and I just wanted to dwell on it a little. The right tree in the right place. Well, what does that actually mean? And what does that mean in the Highlands? So the picture you should be seeing just now is of a deer fence with a woodland on one side and a grazed woodland on the other side, and enclosed. And I was going to ask your views on whether that's good or bad, but the key is that deer management is probably still one of the key issues, if not the key issue, in achieving this expansion. And on many sites, we're still reliant on deer fences to achieve woodland. So what does the right tree in the right place, what does that mean? Well, it means combining the owner's objectives with the site capability. And that's a fairly fundamental point that isn't always properly addressed, but what is the site capable of from a tree point of view? But also the sensitivity of the site, other habitats, species, and the public benefit that could be derived. And increasingly we're thinking about integration with other land use, agriculture and sporting, but also, as Paul's mentioned, habitat networks from a native woodland point of view. And then at the back of all this, of course, we've got climate change, which means everything's changing. And you'll be very aware this year of the impact Dutch elm disease and cholera on ash dieback are having. I mean, it's really, really visible in the landscape this year. And I think we have to always think about that, think about the resilience and the robustness of what we're doing to climate change. What it doesn't mean, the right tree in the right place, is it doesn't mean planting on deep peat. In fact, we've been funding a lot of peatland restoration in the Flow Country to remove woodlands that were planted on deep peat. Nor does it mean one size fits all. We try and promote mixed woodlands. There's a heavy emphasis on native species, as I mentioned, in this conservancy, but all woodlands can contribute, regardless of size of species, and small is important. Small is important to us, and it's important to achieving the targets in many ways. And I just wanted to mention, for those of you who don't know, the Woodland Trust are running a Croft Woodlands project, which is an excellent project, or I believe it's an excellent project to support crofters in being able to plant trees on croft lands and overcome the barriers there are to that. I'm kind of hoping that it might appear, but it's not looking good, is it, for my presentation? Maybe we can just make it available afterwards, although it's not quite the same. But I was just going to show you the graph, because there's a lot already going on. So I wanted to tell you about what's been achieved so far. So most planting is done with grant aid, and of woodlands of any scale, that's more than 1/4 of a hectare. That's usually through the forestry grant scheme that we run on behalf of the Scottish Government. So since the forestry grant scheme opened to applications in 2016, we've supported over 10,000 hectares of planting. And that includes 1,200 hectares of natural regeneration. And of that 10,000 hectares, 83% is broadleaved or Caledonian Scots pine. So you can see from that what I was meaning about the emphasis on native species and planting for biodiversity reasons. So we're doing about 2.5. Oh, fantastic. Can everyone see that? It's just.
Is that the right slide, John? Is that the correct slide?
Yeah, perfect. Well done.
Brilliant. Look at that. Excellent.
Yeah. So you can, don't worry about the detail in a way, but the points to make are the emphasis on native, and the curve, the dip and the rise and the dip, that's to do with each Scottish Rural Development Programme. So that's the European 7-year cycles. So we've got agreement and commitment to continue with the forestry grant scheme beyond the 7-year cycles. So that means we shouldn't see that dip. In fact, we need to see a continual rise. You'll see there we've been doing about 2,500 hectares a year for the last the current year and the previous 2 years. Towards the national target, but that needs to go up to 3,000 to 4,000 hectares a year, which is a lot of trees, probably 5 million trees or thereabouts, and that needs to be sustained to deliver the Scottish Government target. So that really is a lot of trees. So last slide, Keith, if we can. Next slide.
Yeah, Andy's controlling because I'm having massive technical problems.
Andy, there's one more, if you could just move on to. Thanks. So in summary, timber production's increasing, new planting's increasing. We're also restoring and regenerating native woodlands. And I suppose what makes perhaps the Highland and Islands area unique is the scale of opportunity. That's the scale of opportunity, both, as Paul's mentioned, from peatlands and also from trees, specifically native woodlands. There really is a real scale of opportunity at the moment. And I'd finish with a quote from Sir John Stirling Maxwell, who you may know was a sort of early pioneer of forestry in Scotland and owned Carrara Estate in Loch Harbour, and was one of the early chairs of the Forestry Commission in 1929. he was chair. And a quote from him was, "How much land devoted to deer forest could be utilised for forestry?" And that quote was made during the First World War. And I think that is probably still the key question today. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That was great, and well done for persevering with that. I'm glad we got your final 2 slides at least, and we'll certainly make sure that the presentation is put on the website following today's seminar. Yeah, I think there's wonderful opportunities for woodland restoration in Highland, along with all the other things that we heard from with Paul earlier on. So we look forward to discussing that in a moment. We've had a number of questions in and a couple of comments. One of the comments is a request to provide a link to the Crofter scheme. So we'll certainly do that. Another comment was about the fact that we all need to look after the trees in our own gardens, which I also think is a great place to start. But perhaps I can turn to Keith and Andy to pull out some of the other questions that are coming through and direct them to John.
Yeah, sure, happy to do that. First question, John, is what importance does Forestry Scotland attach to natural regeneration rather than planting?
Thanks. Yeah, we do place considerable emphasis on that because of the biodiversity benefits of expanding our remnant native woodlands, often quite fragmented. So we do place priority on that. Unfortunately, I would say the funding isn't as good for that as it could be, and there's many reasons behind that. And it's also a bit harder to accurately measure the carbon sequestration of regeneration. So it is a priority, it is important. However, the funding isn't as good as it could be. And as you'll know, there's many places in the Highlands and Islands where we're very limited in our seed source.
Okay, thank you, John.
Thanks, John. There's actually another question in relation to seeds, if you bear with me.
I'll just add
is there any support available for people who want to start seed collection or tree nurseries?
There is support for tree nurseries, actually, which is something unique to Scotland, actually. And funnily enough, DEFRA recently have been trying to take on board what we've been doing, because if you want to plant anyway, the sort of numbers that have been talked about across the UK, you need nurseries, and you need good tree nurseries, and you need lots of them producing a lot of trees. So yeah, we do have support for nurseries, and again, it's kind of like every national grant scheme. It maybe doesn't suit every situation, but we have managed to use it to support some of the more local tree nurseries that we've seen developing in the West Highlands. So yeah, I can certainly pass on the links to that. It's under the forestry grant scheme.
That would be really helpful, thank you. There's quite an interesting comment here about the health benefits of spending time in woodland being increasingly promoted, as well as the importance of restoring a cultural relationship with Scotland's woodlands. In your opinion, is there a conflict between giving people access to woodlands and preserving them as habitats? And if so, how can that be overcome?
I would say, in a general rule, no. And if there is, there has some specific situations like capercaillie, where there's or disturbance of breeding birds. The way to overcome that is via engagement, because fundamentally, the woodland should be providing benefits to the people of Scotland. I mean, that's a fundamental, I think, but perhaps not every bit provides the same amount of benefit. So we're trying to encourage more use of more urban woodlands. We've got a special enhanced level of grant aid for urban woodlands. And by urban, I mean relatively, towns and large settlements. So no, I do think that's a fundamental, and I think engagement. And I was going to, I forgot to mention in my presentation, community support for tree planting is a fundamental if we're going to get anywhere near these figures that have been talked about. And that was one question I was going to pose: is do we have that, and will that continue?
Great, thank you. And that's actually been brought up in a couple of comments in terms of how can communities get involved in planting trees on available land, and if there is funding available, what kind of funding is available, what kind of levels are we looking at? In terms of community orchards in particular as well.
Yeah, there is funding available, and we've got a particular separate fund, separate from the forestry grant scheme. We run a community fund, which is specifically for community groups that want to engage more and use the woodlands more. So that's slightly less bureaucratic to access, and I can give you the information on that. It's on our website. So we are very keen to use any mechanism possible to enable communities to get involved and specifically help achieve the tree planting and tree regeneration that we need.
Excellent, thanks, John.
Okay. Thank you, John. Yeah, we've probably got time for a couple more questions, Keith, and then we'll move on to the next speaker.
Okay, great. One question, how is Forestry and Land Scotland looking to improve biodiversity in commercial woodland? Will there be a move away from clear felling?
Well, I can't speak on behalf of Forestry and Land Scotland because they are a totally separate agency now that manages the estate. But I can speak on behalf of Scottish Forestry as the regulator of all forests, including those forests. So yes, sustainable forest management in Scotland is enshrined in the new Forestry Act that I mentioned, and it's underpinned by something called the UK Forestry Standard, which requires certain minimum requirements for biodiversity. I mean, it covers everything else as well, but for biodiversity. So every time a forest is felled or restructured or is replanted, should improve the biodiversity value of the forest. There is more interest in not clear felling, using systems of tree management that avoid clear felling, but that's still in the minority. I mean, as you'll know from anywhere in the Highlands, most of the forests are being clear felled, and that's to do with the legacy of how they were established and the species and everything else. It's another reason, actually, why native species can be productive. There tends to be a silo mentality about conifers are productive, native species are not productive, which is totally untrue, of course, in that we have Scots pine and birch and oak and other native species that could be hugely productive and are, and give you much more scope for silvicultural systems that don't rely necessarily on clear felling. That was a bit long-winded, sorry.
One more question, Keith, and then I think we'll move on.
I'll just come in there quickly, if that's okay, Ben. And there's a
sure.
question back up near the beginning, and it's just asking whether legislation is being implemented to control deer numbers, and that's specifically in relation to allowing natural regeneration and rewilding.
Well, that I'm afraid I'll sort of duck that in a way, in that that's Nature Scot is responsible for the deer legislation in Scotland. What we're doing is actively supporting areas where deer reduction can be done to achieve regeneration. And although I said most plantings still rely on deer fencing, there has been a change in the last 10 years, and there's increasingly areas where NGOs, private owners, or a mix of the two, communities are trying to address deer over a landscape scale to promote regeneration. And we're supporting that through grant aid because it costs. It's not as though fencing is free. It costs money because of the intensity of the deer management. But that is bearing fruits now. It's a long-term game and takes many years for the trees to regenerate. But there's some really exciting projects now scattered around the Highlands where people are starting to see the results of that work. Probably not enough's made of that, to be honest.
Okay, thank you, John. I think the Cairngorms Connect is a good example of that, and it's certainly worth people looking into that as a good rewilding project if you are wanting more information. There's a whole string of questions are still coming through, and it's interesting that there's a dialogue going on about community orchards, and some connections are being made there from the participants, so that's good to see.
Yeah,
I would emphasize again that, we will get back to people on questions that we haven't had the chance to address, and they'll go onto the website in the next couple of weeks. But I am going to draw a line under it there. That was really useful, John, your presentation and the follow-up questions. It's good to see so much interest in this subject. But I'm now going to turn to our final speaker, who is Andrew Midgely, Senior Land Use Policy Officer with RSPB Scotland. So Andrew's work focuses on climate change and land use policy. He's currently working on agricultural policy issues relating to climate change, peatland issues, and regional approaches to land use. So Andrew believes that land use and management have a vital role to play in helping us to meet our net zero targets in 2045. Prior to joining RSPB, he worked with NFU Scotland and Scottish Land and Estates. So thank you, Andrew, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ben. Hello, everyone, and thank you to the network for inviting RSPB to speak. So I'm just going to share my screen, and hopefully this will work. So I'm not hearing anything that's saying it's not working, so you should be able to see a blue slide, nature conservation and climate change. So what I'm going to do, I'll whip through these quickly. I think I've really enjoyed the conversation, the questions, and hopefully we'll get to that quickly because I think it's really constructive and interesting. So there's quite a lot of overlap in some of what I've got to say with both Paul and John. So it looks like we're in a similar sort of space in thinking about the issues. So what I want to do, first of all, is to, well, essentially, I'm going to be very briefly just look at some of the impacts and some of the challenges that it raises for nature conservation organisations like the RSPB. And then I'll just look at some examples of what's going on the ground. And I've broken that down into two different ways of thinking about that. So the first one there is dealing with the impacts of climate change. So, what can we do on the ground to think about the changes that are happening and how we deal with that? And I've got two examples of Seabirds and Cairngorms Connect. And then I'll just go and look at actually, conservation organisations are fairly significant land managers in their own right and can do something to reduce emissions themselves. And so I'd use the example of Forsenard. Now, there's different ways to look at these examples, and they are relevant to all sorts of ways of looking at climate change. It's just that these are the ways I've chosen to look at them today. And then finally, what I want to do is look very briefly at some of the policy that the RSPB is trying to engage in. Before I go on, I'll explain that my role is primarily around climate change policy. And so what I've done in putting this together was to approach colleagues that are working on the ground to get some of their input. And so what I'll be doing is talking a little bit about what other people in the organisation are doing. When we get more onto the policy, that's more sort of where I focus my time. So just very briefly, I'm sure that actually most people are fully aware of the sorts of things that we're facing. But the key point here is that in the context of a changing climate, which drives an ecological response, we then have to deal with change, and that presents the challenge. So when we see changing ecology, especially when we have a conservation system that's primarily site-based, whether it's through SSIs or SPAs or through nature reserves that are owned, it presents a bit of a challenge. So if we have things changing, like trees leafing earlier, if we have butterflies on the wing earlier, if we have wetlands potentially inundated on the coast or drying out in the uplands because of extreme summers, things like that, or if we have changes in the marine environment in the context of having fixed breeding sites, we end up with lots of issues to deal with that. So other examples might be sort of changing behavior because of food availability for different species, thinking about birds and food availability and different seasons. And thinking about, these are some of the things that Paul talked about, thinking about the species that might be on the edges of those ranges and the potential to lose those things. So climate change presents us with a management challenge, especially if our focus is on special sites. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't be thinking about special sites. So protected areas will remain vital, but we do have to think about resilience, and that's a word that's come up before. So if we think about examples of SPAs, they will still deliver for wildlife. They will still be important, but there will be changes. So places like inch marshes, for example, will experience change, but they will remain, they will stay places that have high species biodiversity. It's just that there will be change in that site. Similarly, Atlantic oatwoods will remain really important species-rich habitats, but there will be change. So the question that we then face is, well, how do we build resilience to change, both inside and outside of protected areas? And so as a conservation organisation, those are the sorts of things we're grappling with. So I'll just look at a couple of examples of the sorts of things that are happening. So the first one, this is about how do we sort of mitigate those impacts. The first one, it's very brief reference, is to do with seabirds. And now you may think, oh, is that really a climate change thing? Well, I guess the reason I'm raising it is if you have fixed breeding sites, but the marine environment is changing around those fixed breeding sites, and the breeding seabirds are having to go and forage further afield, that puts pressure on the birds themselves, then they have, in the context of climate change, a challenge anyway. And the reason I flag this is because of the efforts that have been made in various islands around the coast. And this is just one example, a screenshot from the Shants. If we're able to take away some of the other threats that also put those breeding colonies under threat, then we at least build some form of resilience to give them a fighting chance. So that was just one example of how we can think about building resilience. The next example is to do with Cairngorms Connect, and I'm sure this is a high profile project. I'm sure lots of you have heard about it before, and I sort of emphasize that this is what the colleagues are involved in here. But the reason I flag it is because when we start to think about the challenges of particular places, we end up having to start thinking at a bigger scale and about networks. So we have to start thinking landscape scale and how things are joined together. So, and this is the sort of the overlap with some of what Paul was saying. I just emphasize here that some of this imagery is copyrighted and therefore shouldn't be used. It was something that was emphasized to me when I was allowed to borrow the slides. So, Cairngorms Connect, many of you will be familiar with the size of what's being proposed here. Several landowners, including RSPB, Nature Scot, Wildland Limited, Forestry and Land Scotland, are working collectively as a partnership in the biggest habitat restoration project in the UK. There's got lots of different elements to it, but there's a very long-term vision to see expansion of woodland, including montane woodland. And over the short term, so there's a whole series of 5-year objectives. So to plant 600 hectares of new native woodland, and a big chunk of that's already been achieved by Wildland Limited, to focus on or to enable to allow 800 hectares of Scots pine regeneration. So that's that's 5-year objective, let alone the long term. And then it's also about restoring processes. So there's a big element of the work is to do with restoring the forest processes by intervening in various ways. So in this particular case, it's removing non-native conifers from nearly 7,000 hectares of forest. And then in addition to that, there's work to restructure plantations, so just under 2,000 hectares over the next 5 years. Again, it's all about sort of improving forest processes. And then on top of that, there is a whole raft of work looking at restoring hydrological processes. So this is about, in this particular instance, it's about restoring over 1,000 hectares of floodplain. Now, we don't have a slide about it, but I was up in Abernethy just last week looking at the peatland restoration project that's taking place on the side of Bynet Moor, and that's part of this work as well. So large-scale peatland restoration is also part of this coordinated set of activities, which is about improving, expanding woodlands, sort of establishing more natural forest processes, and that all of this links together in such a way that it's about an interconnected landscape scale habitat restoration. It's hugely ambitious, and we can, although there are lots of objectives in this piece of this project, we can see it as actually having a really important role to play in mitigating for the effects of climate change. So these are, I'm not going to go through them in detail. These are just some of the things that all of that package of work will do. So it's about slowing the flow of water. It's an increasing catchment friction. It's about sort of expanding woodlands. It's about restoring floodplains. So bigger forest would make the landscape more resilient to the sorts of change that may be coming. A more sort of natural graduation of forest may also, from sort of down at the Spey right the way up into the mountains, would serve the same function. Then we've got things to do with slowing flood mitigation and dealing with the possible downstream impacts. So all in all, this is one way that we as a nature conservation organisation recognise that we have to work with others at a large scale in a coordinated way to try and deal with the challenges that we face in the context of climate change. So that's mitigating the impacts. There's another way that we can think about it as an organisation, and that is thinking about how we can also contribute to reducing emissions. So I use the example here of Forsenard, and I'm sure that it's high profile and everyone will be familiar with the site and the nature of the flow country. So it's the RSPB's largest land holding at 21,000 hectares and is obviously part of the flow country, which holds the biggest area of peat in Europe. It's a really important site for us, for both nature and for carbon. And what we've been doing there, again, you'll be familiar with it, there was reference to it earlier on, about the planting in the flow country through the 70s and 80s. And this might be something that we might come back to later. If we're now seeing similar levels of planting, this is clearly not where we want to go. But what we have been doing is trying to deal with some of the consequences of that. So from the planting that was done in some areas of the flow country where the bog was damaged and prevented the healthy functioning of peatland systems, what we've been trying to do is take some of that large-scale forestry out again. And over the last 15 years, we've removed large areas of forestry. And the issue here is we shouldn't necessarily, it's about, as John was saying, it's the right tree in the right place. And in this instance, it's actually recognizing the value of the peatland systems. So what we've done has been removing forestry and then using a whole range of techniques to work out how best to re-establish a functioning peatland system. So some of that's been through mulching, some of the brash, for example, and leaving it on site. Some of it has been about reprofiling and some of the drainage ditches and so on. And we've been blocking lots of those in various ways, either through sort of pulling peat in from the sides or putting in dams additionally. And you can see some of that in this image. This is, after forestry has been taken away, you begin to try and sort of rehydrate the landscape. So if you look at the dots on the right hand side, each of one of those little dots is kind of water that's been kept on site after the creation of small sort of pull-in dams. So this is really important, and the reason I've flagged this is we as a nature conservation agency can contribute to reducing emissions, because damaged peatlands are sources of emissions, and what we're trying to do here is take a peatland which is a source of emissions and put it back into a functioning peatland, which would then sequester a smaller amount of emissions annually, but then lock up large amounts of carbon over the long term. So we have an important role to play in that big picture of reducing emissions. So those are some of the things that are on the ground, but organisations like RSPB are also sort of advocacy organisations. So we try to sort of engage in debates about, well, what should we be doing, and can we change the nature of what we're doing so that we enhance the policy for nature and for the environment. So some of the things that we've been working on most recently, and this is the stuff that I work on most closely, is around climate change and land use policy. And this very is a slide that Paul showed earlier is very similar to this, and I think is just one of the most important sort of things that drives what I do. It's a really important slide for me, this, because anything above this line, the blue boxes, are emissions. So there are emissions from agriculture, from transport, business, energy, and so on. And this is from 2018. Below the line are removals, sequestration. And we've committed as a country in legislation to get to net zero by 2045. And that means that by 2045, emissions will be equal to removals. And this just shows the scale of the challenge. We have to reduce all the emissions that we currently have into a much smaller amount of emissions. And that means really significant change in the way we do virtually everything. But at the same time, we have to increase the amount that we take out of the atmosphere. And that means really significant change in land use. And so we face huge challenges. And so this, I use this image as a way of helping me conceptualize the scale of the challenge that we face over the next couple of decades. It's incredibly difficult, or it will be, and we've got a long way to go, and it's going to be quite a convoluted process. So how do we as nature conservation organizations fit into this? Well, last year, RSPB went through a bit of a process of trying to look at, well, what's nature's role in this? And so we mapped what we called nature areas, the sort of the areas that were good for nature, and then we tried to calculate how much carbon was in those areas. And we were able to then sort of work out that, we were able to say that actually looking after nature is a really important part of looking after carbon, but we were also able to say that nature that is in poor condition is less able to contribute to reducing emissions and to storing carbon than nature that is in good condition. So what we need to do is invest in looking after nature as part of our efforts to get to net zero. And Paul talked about nature-based solutions, and that's precisely where conservation organisations come in terms of seeking to enhance the use of nature-based solutions. It has to be a big part of our attempts to get to net zero. But then we do get, if we think back to this diagram, I'll just go back again. If we think, how do we increase the amount of removals? Yes, putting nature into good condition will have a role to play, but it won't go far enough. We will need more. And so you get into questions of land use change. If we're going to expand the woodland tree planting woodland area, as John alluded to, we get into the question of, well, how are we going to do that? Where is it going to go? And so in 2018, I think it was, the Committee on Climate Change released its net zero report, and they basically said that they would expect under their modelling to see a 20% reduction in agricultural area, with that 20% going to another use, and primarily that would be peatland restoration and woodland creation. So we're talking about large-scale land use change. But where should that take place? Where, you know, where might we want to? Would we want to be planting on agricultural land, would we be planting on shallow peat? And what are the trade-offs? And how much carbon do you lose from planting on shallow peat? And or how much food do you lose from planting on agricultural land? We face some really difficult questions. And so what we're interested in is trying to explore some of that, some of the trade-offs, and so that we do a sensible thing. I mean, some of this, to be completely sort of straightforward about it, some of this is driven by concerns that we could, if we just put climate goggles on, we could forget about nature. We have to remember that we're looking at a nature and a climate emergency, and that they are linked. But we could just think we just have to deal with climate change, and we just look through at sort of that particular lens. You could take some policy choices which could have negative consequences for nature. So what we need to do is make sure that we look at them at the same time, and that leads you into this conversation about, well, okay, where are the trade-offs and how do we deal with that? So we've been doing some in-house work, just trying to identify some of where the opportunities might be. Now, this work is ongoing, and it will be published it'll be released in a sort of a month or 6 weeks or so. I'm just drawing attention to it to illustrate the sorts of things that we're doing, trying to think through some of these processes. So we just, through a GIS sort of approach, we've tried to identify, well, if we know where the peatland is, and we exclude that, if we know where protected areas are and we exclude that, if we know where the current woodland is and we exclude that, where's left? And then if we look at that land, what are the potential risks? So if shallow peat, there might be balancing, difficult balancing acts around planting and where would be appropriate. And then there'd be other places as well. So we've identified where there may be opportunities to think about woodland creation, and this links with lots of people are operating in this space. James Hilton Institute's done something similar. Scottish Forestry and Forest Research are clearly, thinking very hard about these things too. What we're trying to do is just think, well, how do we make a contribution to this? Think, well, what does it mean for nature? So what all of this needs to together with is a broader set of advocacy. So we're advocating very strongly for nature-based solutions, but also for a sort of coherent Scottish nature network, which sort of is embedded within the sort of planning system. So that's been a bit of a canter through the various things, but I guess my points would be, firstly, that actually conservation organisations are operating on several fronts. Yes, we're landowners, and we have to deal with the specifics of individual sites, but we can also work with others to have a bigger impact on a larger scale. We can think about mitigating the impacts of climate change, but we can also make a contribution to reducing emissions. We can think about building resilience. We can think about sort of the site and the landscape. So it's a really complicated picture, and there's a whole range of work going on across the organisation, from the peatland restoration to sort of woodland expansion on Abernethy and to removal of woodlands in other places. It's a complicated picture, but we're operating on several fronts. But we also have a role to play in trying to sort of inform some of that policy debate, so that we collectively make good choices for a better environment. And I will stop there and see if I can stop sharing my screen for a second. There we go.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew. That was great. I'm getting some feedback. Hang on a moment. Okay, can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. Thank you, Andrew. That was great. It was well-rounded, and again, another comprehensive presentation that linked really well to the other two as well. And I think you made lots of fascinating points, and the issue of resilience is obviously paramount. And there was a discussion in the chat line about the Cairngorms Connect project and some information sharing going on there. In relation to these landscape scale projects, I'd like to kind of highlight the work that's going on in the Westeros Biosphere Reserve and the Coigach and Assynt Living Landscapes projects as well. They're also really good examples of how people are coming together to look at land use across a wider area. But lots of interesting questions coming through. Quite a range, some very specifically relevant to you, but also some of the other speakers may also wish to chip in. So could I turn to my two facilitators to pull out some of the key questions and direct them initially to Andrew, but then the other speakers as well, where appropriate. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew. This is a really interesting question, and actually the other speakers may want to come on this as well. But it's about perception, and it's about people's perception of peatlands in particular. And do we actually need to change how we see them? Do we also and do we need to do more to promote their cultural, aesthetic, and social value to actually get people interested in peatlands and get them on board with restoring and expanding them? Is there a public perception issue with peatlands?
Yes, I think there is. I suspect colleagues at Forcenard would be horrified, because they spend a lot of time engaging on the community angle and encouraging people to value peatlands. But I'll give you an example. I was working with a colleague, had to make a video about some peatland issues recently, and on a grey day without a season, it's not especially inspiring landscape to sort of get people energized about, because the visuals are a bit tricky. So I can see that there's a sort of perception issue. From my mind, I think that actually it's a bigger question. It's absolutely right to say that we do need to get people to see peatlands differently. I suspect, though, it's part of getting people to see the land differently, and to recognize that actually the land has a huge role to play in our efforts to sort of get to net zero, to mitigate the impacts of climate change. Because when I look at the land and I think, well, how is it being used at the moment? And how is that contributing to getting to net zero and to mitigating climate change? Actually, there's big chunks of it I'll be thinking, actually, should we be doing that? And might we want to change what we're doing? And when you start to look at it through the lens of climate change, you can recognize its value in a different way. So then you begin to see peatlands as really providing a service to us. So although it might not be visually striking, you think actually that's really valuable, because we're collectively trying to meet this massive challenge of getting to net zero by 2045. And that has a big role to play, and it's really important.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. More questions?
Yeah, quite a few more to get through. One of the more interesting ones is in terms of the recent claims by the regional gamekeepers, in that quick surface fires made moist peat more stable, often creating a protective crust which allowed it to retain more of its stored carbon for longer. Do you have any views on that, Andrew?
Yes. Okay, so there was a recent video that made that claim that was on the basis of an individual paper that supported that view of thinking. So I would just say the science on burning is incredibly contested. There's very strident views on either side of this on the science of burning, and I think we take the view that whilst that's contested, actually it's not so contested that the impact of mule burn on biodiversity, on the hydrology, on soils is damaging. So we shouldn't be taking an argument about carbon and then saying, right, we have to carry on with relatively poorly regulated mule burn. We would like to see mule burn become more greatly regulated. So the Grouse Moor Management Review Group actually made that recommendation themselves, saying that mule burn should be licensed, and we would agree with that. And I think it's important to note as well that the suggestion that we should be burning peatlands in order to lock carbon in is actually in direct contravention to the mule burn code, which says that you shouldn't be burning on peatlands.
Okay, thanks, Anne. Next question. Why, and this is going back to one of your slides, I don't know if it might be worth bringing the presentation back up, but why is such a large area excluded from new woodland establishments? It was in relation to the opportunity polygon slide that you presented.
Sure. I'll quickly see if I can do that. So yes, it's so in doing any sort of GIS mapping exercise, the choices that you make then inform the outcome of the model, and some of these things, you know, this isn't meant to be instructive in terms of saying you shouldn't do anything in that space. It's simply, we have to create a model that can then run, and so you have to make some choices. So we excluded areas that were protected, and actually large areas are protected in some way. And you know, it could actually be that there are opportunities to plant trees in those protected areas, but it'd have to be done much more sensitively and under all the rules and so on. So it does look like there's large areas excluded, but we have to remember that there are large areas of peat as well, and we need to be protecting our peat. And so this is the challenge that we're going to face: is how do we balance all of those things? We also do have fairly extensive, you know, wooded areas in some parts of the country too. So I totally accept that it could look slightly odd. What it does point to, though, is a real tension. Is actually, it looks like most of the opportunities are on agricultural land, and therefore we face a difficult challenge about where we plant and what we value most.
Can I comment there? It's John.
Of course, John. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks for that. I was just going to say it's important in the grain or the scale of the map. We have this all the time, and yeah, it looks superficially that map's saying you shouldn't be planting most of the Highlands and Islands or expanding woodland. And I think it's quite often this comes up with peat because of the available data is of a scale that doesn't reflect the mosaics that's actually there in the landscape. So you could say, you know, the whole of the Highlands and Islands has got peat over it if you took one extreme. So I still think there's a lot of scope for expanding woodland, particularly native woodland, throughout that area on Andrew's map. It's about thinking about the actual mosaic on the site and leaving the areas that are peat, but planting or expanding onto the areas that aren't.
Okay, thank you, John. More questions?
Yeah, we have a question here going back to Cairngorm Connect. And how does Cairngorm Connect approach deer management to enable the trees to grow? And the assumption that installing deer fencing on that kind of a large scale is just really not appropriate.
So my understanding is that there's collaborative deer management across the sites, and it's enhanced the level of deer management that's available to those landowners. And so it's additional effort to reduce the grazing pressure. So if I take the example of Abernethy has actually been trying very hard to keep on top of deer numbers in order to allow the expansion, the sort of natural expansion of the core pinewood area. And even in that context, there are some parts of the site which still have deer numbers that make that tricky. So it's additional resource, if you like, to enhance deer management. That's my understanding.
Okay, thank you, Andrew.
Great. Yeah, we've got a question here in respect of planning applications and why planning applications for development are allowed for designated sites, for example, at Cool Links. And just as a follow-up, why are dogs allowed in designated sites? The comment being that on a recent visit to Loch Ruthven last year during the Slavonian grebe breeding season, there were dogs running around and swimming in the reeds where the grebes nest. And I guess we could open that up to any of the presenters.
Perhaps I could answer the second part of that question, Keith, in relation to dogs at Loch Ruthven. So yeah, Loch Ruthven is probably the single most important breeding site for Slavonian grebes in the UK, actually, and people shouldn't be allowing their dogs to be off the leads during that period of time in the summer months, spring and summer. The Outdoor Access Code defines what responsible access is, and keeping your dogs under control, i.e. on a lead, is the requirement of that, particularly in areas where there are sensitivities, such as at Loch Ruthven, and therefore that shouldn't have occurred. I mean, if anybody suspects that an activity is taking place that's causing disturbance to wildlife on protected areas, then that could be a legal issue, and they should refer it to the police wildlife liaison officers. So that shouldn't have occurred. The planning question is slightly more difficult. I don't know if any of the speakers want to have a stab at that, but from a NatureScot point of view, designated sites, we get consulted on planning applications within designated sites, and we advise the local authority in relation to planning applications and in relation to the special interests of those designated sites. And our advice would be that developments need to, take into account the special features, and if they are European features, for example, there's a series of steps that have to go through, and development should only really occur where there are no adverse impacts on the site, the important interests of the site. So there is a process in place to hopefully allow development to take place, but in a way which takes the special interests into account. I mean, I've kind of had a stab at that question. I don't know if anyone else wants to have a go, or whether we can move on to another question, but I'll give any of the speakers an opportunity to comment if they wish.
Just very briefly, I think you've got that right in the sense that designation was never intended to completely preclude anything from happening. So there's a balance that's been struck in public policy between the desire for people to do things, for the need for development, and the need to protect the natural environment. And therefore you get into a process whereby if someone is going to do a development, then that affects a designated site, then it has to be has to get greater scrutiny in order to protect the natural interest. The thing that comes to my mind is that because of that, where we end up, unfortunately, is sometimes in a space where it's difficult for environmental organisations, because it's incredibly costly to try and challenge some of the things that get brought forward. So you end up in legal processes, and you potentially have a sort of environmental justice deficit, because the people who want to develop something, can sometimes channel a huge amount of resource at getting what they want to see happen, and you're trying to defend the natural heritage interest and actually have much weaker position. And so while there is a logical sort of rationale for not completely stopping development, it would be good to have that balance by having a greater sort of weighting, if you like, on the natural heritage.
Thank you, Andrew. We're coming close to our end point, but we do have an opportunity for one, possibly two more questions, and I noticed we do have some more coming in. Perhaps I could pick up the last one that's come in, and it's one for you, Andrew, and it's if 20% of agricultural land needs to be put to alternative use to meet the climate targets, then what do you think local and central government need to do to promote this?
Okay, so there's a whole range of things that need to happen in order to see that. It's a tricky thing. It's not necessarily saying everyone has to do something, but it's what the Committee on Climate Change would expect to see in order for us to get to net zero. So it may be that some people have to change more than others, and some people will have more opportunity to do something. So you could have, say, for example, some farmer on the sort of upland fringe that is undertaking sort of relatively extensive sheep farming that may see an opportunity in planting trees, or and could go for a large area that sort of contributes to that. So they could actually, make a big contribution to that, whereas some of the more precious, if you like, arable land that's producing the bulk of the food that we eat may just be contributing a bit less in terms of area. So how do people promote it more? So the government can do more things by the way that it shapes subsidy, so it can really drive the sort of amount of land. So for example, under ecological focus areas, it could make it a requirement that farmers put a little bit of like every farmer puts a bit of land into an ecological focus area, or it could put much better grant rates into farm woodlands. I know this is something that John and Scottish Forestry will be have been working on with Sheep and Trees Initiative, and encouraging farmers to plant more trees, and that is actually happening, I think. So the way that we pay people to do that is really important. So policy has a role, finance has a role, but it's also, I think, the market. We as consumers have a role as well in terms of the choices that we make about the sorts of things that we buy, and that signals to farmers about what we want. But primarily, I think it's about it's a policy, designing policy to drive farmer behaviour. You're on mute.
Apologies, I was on mute. Yeah, schoolboy error. Yeah, thank you, Andrew. We've got a chance for one more question, so can I turn to either Keith or Andy to pull the last question out? We have had a few more coming in. We're not going to have the time to answer all of them, I'm afraid, in person now, but as I say, we will address them after this seminar. So Keith or Andy, can you please choose the last one?
Yeah, no problem. So I guess the question would be, is NatureScot considering ways to promote the SOAC and reach the new demographic using the outdoors through educational outputs like Open Learn or Coursera modules, or in schools via something like the Curriculum for Excellence?
Okay.
Looks like that. It's Paul here. It looks like that may be one for me, although Ben, you might have wanted to say something. Keith, sorry, can you just repeat the first part of that question? I didn't quite catch it.
Sure. Is NatureScot considering ways to promote the SOAC and reach the new demographic using the outdoors through educational outputs like Open Learn or Coursera modules?
Okay, well, that's a great question, and obviously we understand the background to the question, which I would imagine is to do with the report and the real problem of dirty camping and what's been happening during lockdown and possibly proliferation of camper vans and so on in the Highlands and the mess that we've all witnessed as a result of some of that. So absolutely, it is a role of NatureScot. In fact, we chair that particular group with Scottish Government. The method by which it might be promoted and made more widely known, such that people, will sort of reach the standard of respect and behaviour when they're out in the country. Will have the results that we're looking for. But it's not something that we do. It's not something that NatureScot does on its own. So we're looking at ways in which we can get the message through. I mean, it's in partnership with Scottish Government colleagues, tourism, and so on. So it's not entirely our gift, to do this. So the methods by which it would be done is not, it's not for me to say. But certainly, we cherish the fact that we have, the Scottish Outdoor Access Code, and that we do have, the right and freedom to roam. But equally, it has to be balanced with, a respect for those places that we're going. So really, it's for colleagues within communications, involved in tourism, and involved in access with other partners, both NGO and Scottish Government, to work out the best ways of getting these messages over. I don't know whether others have got things to contribute to that.
Do any of the other speakers wish to comment, bearing in mind that we're now actually at our time? There's other questions coming in now on the whole issue of dirty camping, for want of a better expression, and I'm sure that's a whole topic in itself. But I'm afraid I do have to draw the seminar to a close because we are at the end of our time. It really has been very interesting, and I think the engagement through the questions and the answers that the speakers have given have been really good and enriched the seminar alongside the excellent presentations. So I would like to thank everyone, particularly the three speakers. I'd like to thank Caroline again for making this happen in the first place. And I'd like to thank Andy and Keith for facilitating and pulling out the questions from the chat line. And last but not least, and mostly, I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join us today and for firing all your questions at us. And we will respond to those that we haven't had the chance to today. So with that, thank you and goodbye. You could probably turn the recording off now, Keith.